I'm Jim Semivan, and welcome to episode 10 of TTS Talks. We are very happy to be back talking again with author and scholar Peter Levenda about the Sekret Machines trilogy and the ideas and beliefs that prompted Tom and Peter to write this nonfiction trilogy. And we do hope you will all find this discussion both enlightening and illuminating. For those of you not familiar with TTS Talks, it is a podcast where we take a deep dive into the complexities of our mission here at To the Stars by bringing you one on one conversations with the various people who are helping us achieve our goals and give life to our projects here at To the Stars. And I'm Jim Semivan, co founder of TTS and the vice president of operations. As many of you already know, I was a career officer at, at the Central Intelligence Agency for 25 years, and I have been a consultant for CIA and the IC since my retirement in 2007. I've had a strong interest in and have been a student of what we call the phenomenon for over 45 years. And today I'm very pleased to announce that Peter Levenda will join me again for part two of what will be our three-part series discussing Sekret Machines, Gods, Man, and War, our trilogy of nonfiction books which Peter co-authored with Tom DeLonge. Now, Peter is a well-known author and historian who is highly regarded for his extensive research and knowledge of occultism and occult history. He has an MA in both religious studies and Asian studies from Florida International University and speaks a variety of languages. As I said before, most of them dead. He's penned many unpublished work. Penned many published works on esoteric subjects and is best known for his book, Unholy Alliance, A History of Nazi Involvement with the Occult, and the trilogy, Sinister Forces, A Grimoire of American Political Witchcraft. Sinister Forces, by the way, and I've said this before, is an absolutely excellent and compelling trilogy on what Peter aptly refers to as American political witchcraft. So, Peter has also appeared on numerous television programs on the History and Discovery channels and is considered an expert on Nazi Germany, especially on the extreme religious and esoteric ideas that formed the Nazi worldview. Peter, thank you so much for being here today. Thanks again for taking the time out and having this interview. I put together some questions here for you, and I'll maybe have one or two curveballs in them, but we'll see. But today, Peter will be discussing the second book of the Sekret Machines nonfiction trilogy, Man. In his first book, Gods, which we talked about last week, Peter, you delved deeply into the ancient cultural evidence for contact with non-human entities, discussing the religious and spiritual texts concerned with beings from the heavens, along with our human relationship with these beings. Now, in the second book, you state that you will take the implications of the UFO where science is concerned, and that your goal is to take a multidisciplinary approach to the phenomenon. So, I guess my first question really is to ask you, why do you think we need to take this type of approach, this multidisciplinary approach, instead of, say, letting science alone just handle the question involving the phenomenon?
Well, thanks for the introduction again, Jim. Thanks for having me back. Well, there's a couple of parts to that question. Why do we need something that's not just a purely scientific approach to the phenomenon? In the first place, there's a lot of different kinds of science out there, and they're not necessarily better integrated now than they were 20, 30 years ago. So you have people who specialize in little boxes. So you have the physicists, you have the chemists, you have the biologists, you have geneticists, et cetera, et cetera. And even within those disciplines, they get bifurcated even more. So you have neurobiologists and neuroscientists over here, and you have different types of biologists over there, and you have different types of physicists over here. You have people who specialize in Newtonian physics and people who specialize in quantum mechanics, et cetera, et cetera. So even within science, it's not multidisciplinary yet when it comes to an approach to the phenomenon. But then we have a bigger problem ahead of us, and it's one we've been struggling with, I think, at least for the last 70 years that I can account for in my life, but probably much longer. And that is the cultural aspect of it. I mean, it's not enough for the scientists to say, well, we kind of understand the propulsion, aspect of the phenomenon. We kind of understand how a UAP flies around or seems to fly around space. That's not going to help most of us. who are going to want to know what the cultural impact of this is going to be. I mean, the religions are struggling with this, the idea there might be alien contact. Everybody has their own point of view on this. And we discussed last time the fact that even within the military industrial complex, there's a lot of religious concern over the meaning of an alien intelligence and contact with an alien intelligence. Are we talking about demonic forces, powers from the sky, as it says in the Bible? Or what are we really, discussing then? So we need to address those things, and that's not going to be addressed purely by science. That's not going to help us. We need also, anthropologists to be involved. We need people like me, people who have a religious studies background, involved. We need we need artists, we need musicians, we need people who have something to bring to the table. Because as I've said, I think in Sekret Machines, man, do aliens sing, right?
Right.
We don't really know that. Maybe there's a reason why. Maybe a musician can help us understand that better than a scientist at the moment.
Right.
And also the problem with science is we don't understand science anyway, not anymore.
Right.
We need so much math to understand science, and the scientists are not that comfortable talking about what they know with us because it's this highly specialized language. So all of these reasons are why we need a multidisciplinary approach.
Yeah. Do you think the Vatican has gotten a head start on this, by the way? My understanding is that years ago they decided they were going to look into this topic a little bit more closely.
Sure, I think they're more prepared than we are aware for an event where we have made contact with some kind of an alien or off-planet or ultra-terrestrial force. I think they're kind of comfortable with that, and they can handle it within the religious, the specifically Roman Catholic dogmatic framework. I think they're coming up with ways to explain it, handle it, and to satisfy the fears, perhaps, and the apprehensions of Catholics. And that may go somewhat towards, spreading out and having an effect upon other religions, particularly Christianity. I
Right.
think Islam, for instance, is not too bothered by it. The Quran talks about beings in other places, and Allah is all merciful, all powerful, and why wouldn't there be beings, in other planets? I think there's a long tradition of Islamic thought in this area as well, in terms of astronomy and astrology, etc. So they're a bit more comfortable with it. Other religions, I don't know. Buddhism should be comfortable with it.
Yeah, I was
To
going to
a
say.
Buddhist, it's all illusion anyway. So,
Right. Right.
right.
Right. Well, early on in man, and you take note that alien technology appears far more advanced than our own. And you then pose the question, if the UFO phenomenon represents a technology more advanced than our own, then by how much? And
Mhm.
I'd like you to sort of explain that a little bit, what you meant by that.
Well, if we looked at the alien technology from the perspective of somebody in the late 19th century,
Hmm.
um, their experience was of the flying ship phenomenon, right? So there
Right.
were these airships that were floating around, and we kind of try to understand them, and we depicted them as being big boats that flew in the air with people on them, and there were large searchlights, and we had this whole thing worked out, and it went from coast to coast and across the ocean into Europe. So the airship, thing went on, and we just sat back and wondered at it. Well, it's more than 100 years later, and we've sent people to the moon, and we have probes going out beyond Pluto. So suddenly, our technology has outpaced our culture by so much that at this point we have to ask ourselves, how advanced is the alien technology compared to what we can do? Really, how far is it? If you had asked somebody 100 years ago, they would say light years ahead of us. You ask people today, and we're already in space, we're already flying around, we're already doing remarkable things with computers and with types of science that we didn't even know existed even 50 years ago. So how far advanced is the typical UFO from what we're doing and from what we're going to be in another 10 or 20 years?
Yeah.
If the alien is a kind of androgyne or a kind of robot, a kind of cyborg or something, we're already far along in that area as well. We've developed robots, and we're constantly developing robots, and we're constantly talking about artificially amplified human beings in some ways, right? The cyborg concept, androids, this sort of thing. We're doing all of that. So we're getting closer and closer and closer to this idea, may not be the reality, but this idea that we have of the UFO phenomenon. We're duplicating a lot of that in our own science and technology. So how far, what is the distance? And is the distance still light years away? Are we being fooled into thinking that we're approaching their science when we're really not? We're just amplifying our own.
Yeah, that's a very interesting take. So, am I picking up hints of optimism here that we may be close to understanding this phenomenon? Or
I think we're closer now than we've been before. I think our problem is we are struggling with one very big basic concept, and I have a feeling we're going to get into it, and that is the relationship of consciousness to reality and consciousness to science. What is the interface there? And I think that's our major stumbling block right now. We
yeah,
kind of still keep those things in separate boxes, and that's probably a mistake.
yeah, we are definitely going to get to that. And I hope you don't mind if this conversation is slightly disjointed. There are so many things I want to talk to you about, and I want to make sure I get them all in. But throughout your book, you started talking about abductions for the first time and a little bit more detail. And regarding abductions, you said that all those nightmarish experiences by alien abductees may be due to machines inspecting what they believe to be other machines, us. Care to talk about that a little bit?
No. Yeah,
Okay,
okay.
I don't blame you. Right after my nightmarish experience, yes,
Exactly.
yeah,
Well, it's like this. It goes into deep. We went into this deeply in the second volume. Really, we went to chapters and trying to figure out what the alien is from the point of view of anthropology or from the point of view of the observations of people who claim they've seen aliens,
yeah,
alien beings, and they look machine-like. They do not seem to perspire. They do not seem to have any flatulence, to be blunt. They don't eat anything. They don't drink anything. Maybe they are machines. And if they are machines, maybe all that the machine understands is another machine. Maybe we're kind of a mystery to the machine. The machine is attempting to understand what kind of machine we are. We would try to understand them in terms of humans, in terms of anthropology. We would look at these things and think they're living beings, right? But maybe they're not. Maybe they're machines, and maybe they're looking at us thinking that we're machines and we're not. So the idea is they're experimenting on us because they're trying to take apart the machine and figure out how it works. And some of these hideous experiences people have had. John Mack has written about them. You know, the PTSD that alien abductees have experienced is due to being probed, being manipulated, being controlled by a machine, thinking that this is a machine they're dealing with. So what's the harm? What's the damage, right?
right,
So it may be something like that. And I think that a machine might be more capable of evaluating another machine in terms of a threat potential. If a machine has no experience of a human being, God help us both,
yeah,
because they're assuming a logical framework that may not exist. We're not the most logical of creatures in the world. We're creating logical creatures and we're having a hard time with them. We're
yes,
creating computers and robots and all kinds of digitally enhanced structures all over the world. These are logical, and we're basically at heart not that logical. We're forcing ourselves to understand this and to protect ourselves from it, from artificial intelligence, for instance.
mhm,
What if a machine is contemplating us the same way? They're trying to understand us from a threat perspective. Are we a threat to them somehow?
yeah,
And in what way? What makes us a threat? How do they dissect us and fix us if they think
mhm,
that we're malfunctioning? All of these things might be happening. We just don't know because we don't know if the alien is a machine. And the big question: who created that machine?
yeah. Can you talk about the alien abduction ritual in a historical sense? Because you did delve into that a lot in the book. And have we seen, excuse me, evidence of the same scenario in historical records? And how far does this go back? I'm thinking about the mind control experiments we have all heard about, say in MK Ultra, these other things.
Well, Jim, why don't we have that discussion?
No, no, no. That was way before my time.
I know. I'm just
Yes,
kidding.
yes. Shame on them for doing that. I might add. Not a big fan of that, but
It was inevitable. It would come up. Sure.
Yeah.
Um, well, it's like this. Yeah, well, there's two big, heavy questions you have out there: the ancient historical precedents for it, and then the more recent ones.
Yeah, Jock talks a lot about this, right? In
Yeah,
Passport to Magonia, and then you get,
sure.
even I think Tom Bullard in his book, UFOs and Modern UFOs and the Myth and Mystery of UFOs. Yes.
I mean, the idea that humans are abducted or taken to someplace else by mysterious creatures is very ancient. It's all over the world, and every culture has its word for that particular creature that does that. In some cases, in the ancient Middle East, there was the Lilitu, from which we get the word Lilith, supposedly Adam's first wife. By the way, according to some Jewish traditions. And this Lilith steals babies, right? Will steal an infant, will steal a child. The idea of a child stealing spirit is common throughout the world. It may have to do with anxiety about childbirth and child fatality, for instance, things like that. But then there's also the things that I grew up with when I was a kid, talking about, there are people out there who will steal children, who will steal you if you're not careful. In those days, where I was living and the kind of things that I heard from my parents, we had to be aware of gypsies, right? The
Yeah. Right.
gypsies would come and steal the children, right? Of course, it was nonsense, but this is something that was around. Other kinds of motifs like that. There's this idea that there are beings that do this. More um, complicated issues then come to the incubi, succubi, these beings that come in the middle of the night. They steal semen from the male and they impregnate women to give birth to horrible creatures or something. There's the witches' Sabbath, where witches basically will steal people and take them to a Sabbath on top of a mountain somewhere and perform hideous sacrifices. The whole satanic panic of the 80s was based on this very old medieval concept that witches are being stolen. The Salem witchcraft trials talked about a man in black, by the way, who would show up and then tell people, okay, the Sabbath is taking place. All the witches had to go and meet there. And then people would disappear. People would have these horrible experiences and then recount them during the trials. So you have this thing that goes on where people imagine or they're recounting an actual experience. They have no other way to describe that experience except to say it was the witch or it was a devil or a demon or some spiritual force took me. And quite often there's a sexual component to it as well. And then they're brought back again. And people have tried to claim it's a form of a sleep disorder, right? That you're having a sleep disorder. You feel you're being captured and you can't move. And it's really just, don't worry about it. Nothing to see here. It's a neurological condition. For people who've had both, they know there's a tremendous difference between the kind of sleep disorder that psychiatrists are talking about and the alien abduction experience, which is much more detailed and much more
Right.
involved than that. So a lot more work has to be done. And psychiatrists, by the way, as part of this multidisciplinary approach, they have to be more open to it in the way that John Mack was. We need that kind of openness, listening to people and trying to figure out what the common denominators are. But when you go to MK Ultra, the fascinating part about this and the relevance it has to the UFO phenomenon, as we will see, is that there was this concerted effort to try to unpack consciousness, the black box, try to figure out what's going on in there. As misguided and as hideous in some cases as it was, I can kind of understand the desire to do this because there was fear that maybe another government was doing that another government understood consciousness better than we did. And the excesses that were taken because people didn't know. They didn't understand what they were dealing with. I think my my approach to it in Sinister Forces was to look at it as a kind of shamanic thing. It was a magical occult operation, basically, but without any of the safeguards. The people were not willing participants. They were unwilling. Imagine you're being initiated into a secret society unwillingly, right?
You're
So you're
right.
captured, you're taken off the street and you're given all these, behavior modification things and rituals are happening and there's hypnosis and drugs and all the rest of it. And you have no clue what's going on. Yeah, that's wrong. Okay.
Yeah.
But the systems and the methods were kind of similar, but they got really more drastic. And one I want to talk about is Dr. Ewan Cameron in Montreal, the depatterning uh, processes that he did. He wanted to wipe people's memories completely and then replace them with other memories. This was like the holy grail. Can we completely erase a person's personality, and give them other memories, other thoughts, and make them think other things have happened? From a strategic point of view, of course, this seems very valuable. But from the point of view of human psychology and our relationship to the alien, our relationship to contact with a non-human or a non-terrestrial agency, what are the implications of that? When we experience the UFO, when we see one in the sky, or when we have the alien abduction experience, for instance, is this an instance of memories being wiped and replaced? Is this an instance of a false memory being implanted by something else to make us think we saw what we saw? Is it a screen memory? I had this discussion with Whitley Strieber over years, back in the 90s. Were experiences of alien abduction screen memories for something much more hideous that was taking place? Were these Nazi experiments, for instance, on unwitting subjects? Were these MK Ultra type experiences? Or was the alien itself responsible for implanting memories? Since we don't understand our consciousness yet, not really, we can't answer these questions, and that's a problem.
Are you saying, or do you believe that these ideas of abduction, did you find them, in all the different cultures? They're obviously all there, but do you see this as polycentric, or did you see this as starting someplace and then going out, and moving out someplace, monocentric? It is
Mhm.
started here and then it sort of drifted, through civilization. Do you think that each individual civilization that existed always had these same things?
Oh, I think it's polycentric. I think that the interpretation of it, however, is influenced by other civilizations, right? So
Right.
you have this kind of syncretism going on between different cultures, especially the spiritual specialists in those cultures, trying to understand their experience by trying to understand another culture's experience, right?
Right.
So you have that going on. And I think that, we're talking about occultism in the 20th and 21st century. It's syncretic that way in that they're comparing notes from different cultures. I remember I had a professor, a Jewish studies professor, who was part of a delegation that went to see the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama wanted information from the Jewish rabbis. How do you keep your culture intact during diaspora? Since the Tibetans facing the same thing. But there was a side conversation going on, and that was between the Jewish mystics and the Tibetan mystics. And they were comparing notes. Oh, do you do it this way? Do you do it that way? How does this happen? What is your experience about that? That's still going on. And these people now, they've already contaminated each other from this point of view.
Right.
So now they're going to start using terms and ideas and concepts in their own culture that they got from another one. You saw that happening like in situ, right there, sort of in a laboratory context. So I think that the experience, the core experience, is polycentric. It arrives everywhere across the globe. The interpretation of it, though, is we're influencing each other in our interpretations. And this is what science complains about. They say, well, you didn't really see a flying saucer because you saw a flying saucer in a movie, 10 years ago, and now you're projecting that onto this experience, and it really wasn't there. So they're missing the point. The point is that we are struggling to put a word and an image on an experience that we had. And the UFO seems to work that way. The flying saucers seem to work.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because, but that always sort of, I found funny when people say that, when scientists point out that, oh, you're just projecting, you're seeing a
Right,
saucer because you watch Flash Gordon.
right.
Well, why is it just saucers that people are talking about? Why isn't it, dinosaurs flying upside down,
Exactly.
with Christmas tree lights hanging on them? I mean, there could be a million different variations, but there aren't. They're
No.
just flying saucers. So, dang it. Well, let's
And
jump to something. Well, go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
said I've never seen Emperor Ming, so I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. Now, let's jump to something a little bit more basic here. You stated also in the book, very early on in the book, that a cardinal mistake and a source of great confusion has been the almost universal substitution of the UFO phenomenon for the phenomenon itself. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's actually a quotation from Alan Hynek.
Oh, okay.
And what Hynek said was the mistake is the almost universal substitution of an interpretation of the UFO phenomenon for the phenomenon itself. It's the interpretation that's the mistake, right?
Yeah.
Which is what we just talked about. We're going to make an interpretation of it, and we're going to use that interpretation and say that everybody's crazy because there are no little green men on Mars. You know, so since there's no little green men on Mars, the entire UFO, phenomenon is a hoax and it's not real, and you're delusional. So when you come up with an interpretation and you make that the interpretation, you've screwed up, right? Because right now we're not really at that stage yet. We don't have a the interpretation. But when a scientist or people like that point at, a prevailing cultural meme or a trope about UFOs and say, well, that's wrong, therefore there are no UFOs, that's not scientific method, right?
No, no.
That's just politics, right? That's just an excuse to denigrate, the whole field and say we don't have to look at this. So that's what I meant by that. We are substituting, and the UFO community is guilty of this as well, when they shouldn't be. But this is what they've done. You have people promoting their interpretation as the interpretation. UFOs are benevolent. They're angelic. They want our best. You have our best intentions at heart. UFOs are demonic. They're trying to destroy us. And variations of all of that. There are hundreds of different races, and there's this one and that one and the other one, and they're doing this and they're doing that. So once you come up with these interpretations, people listen to it and they say, well, that doesn't sound right. So they dismiss the entire field. You've got to keep an open mind, especially those who think they know the truth or think they have a handle on it. They cannot, if they keep promoting it this way, they're just going to add to the confusion. So substituting an interpretation is always going to be wrong until we've got a lot more information to work with. It's like a police officer, a police detective, determining in advance who the perp is, in a murder case, without looking at the rest of the evidence. And more evidence comes up that says that perp isn't the perp, and you dismiss it because you like this guy for it. That's a trope on TV Law and Order episodes constantly. So this is a mistake that ufologists quite often make. They mistake, an interpretation for the evidence.
Yeah, it seems like we're always in a quest for order. I think it's like we want an orderly universe,
Mm.
and we want to explain things all the time. When really, I mean, even Einstein, when he couldn't explain entanglement, he said God doesn't play, dice with the universe.
Right.
Well, because he didn't like that idea. He really did like, an orderly universe. So throughout the book, you also talk about the nature of our collective reality, and can you talk a bit about reality being a fluid concept before the advent of the scientific revolution? I thought that was fascinating, and we saw things much differently back in early history. Is that correct? I mean, I never sort of heard of that before until you brought it up.
Well, Thomas Kuhn writes about scientific revolutions, right? His famous book, and so you have, throughout history, a scientific revolution, quote unquote, which changes everything. But the difficulty with it is, we mentioned before that science has become so bifurcated that people don't know what it is anymore. And one scientist in one area may know nothing about a scientist in another area. But back before the scientific revolutions, the big ones of the 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, a scientist was an observer of nature, and it was an observation that was integrated with spiritual and philosophical ideas as well. It was all integrated together. You couldn't have science sitting alone separately from what you went through in the course of normal life. When you had geniuses like Da Vinci, for instance, inventing machinery and painting paintings and pictures and doing statues and sculpting and doing all of this, involved politically, involved militarily, involved in the arts, involved in all of this, he was integrating all of these things into one grand concept. But we don't talk about Da Vinci as a scientific theorist, really. He was reacting to what was around at the time and integrating it as much as possible. The idea of the Renaissance man. We don't have a Renaissance man or woman right now because it's impossible to integrate all of this, right? Now, reality, what a concept, as Robin Williams used to say. Reality is a construction. We're kind of at the point now where we understand that. What we see as reality is a construction of our senses. Scientists have understood that there are colors that we cannot see. There's light on the spectrum that we don't visually see because we don't need to. It wasn't necessary for survival. There's sounds we don't hear. Dogs can hear them famously, but we can't hear them. There are smells we can't smell. Again, dogs have a great olfactory sense. All of this is out there. It's part of reality, but it's not part of our reality. And once you say our reality, well, then all bets are off, right?
Right.
What's reality to an alien, right? They're going to see something perhaps much more differently than we are. We constantly anthropomorphize this problem to the point where it loses its relevance and its meaning, and we think we understand it. So we use math, for instance, as the major determinant of science. And as we said before, we don't understand math anymore. It's not simple arithmetic, certainly. It's not even simple algebra. It's not even calculus. We're in a different world with where mathematics is the kind of math we need for science. And it's become almost a kind of Kabbalah, right? It's almost
Right.
a secret jargon that only the math specialists know. Quantum mechanics is based a lot of that. String theory is impossible to understand without all kinds of very advanced mathematical concepts. That sounds like incantations to us because we have no box to put it in. It doesn't matter if we've gone to college. Doesn't matter if if we've studied calculus. We still don't know what they're talking about. So science itself, as a determinant of reality, is problematic. My world, day to day, uses things developed by science. I think in scientific terms a lot. Scientific method tests things to prove if they're right or wrong. Is it repeatable, et cetera, et cetera. But I know there's experiences that I've had and experiences that most people have had that are not repeatable, right? That don't
Right.
really adhere to the scientific method, that if you talk about them, scientists shrug their shoulders and say, well, that's a subjective experience, it's anecdotal, whatever. Yeah, maybe, but to me, it's my reality, right? To me, it's a core part of my reality, experiences that I had when I was a teenager or in my 20s, et cetera, or in my 60s. Anyway, those kinds of experiences, they accumulate and they're part of your reality. And there's no scientific, reasoning for that. And if we can understand this, and we understand that the scientific view of reality is becoming narrower and narrower when it should be becoming broader and broader, to incorporate the alien experience, to accommodate the UFO phenomenon, we're going to be kind of stuck in the mud a little bit, which is why, as I said, we need multidisciplinary approach to this. We need scientists, absolutely, but we also need the non-scientists because they're bringing a different version, a different vision of reality to the table.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I remember, when psychology first, hit with William James many years ago, around turn of the century. A lot of doctors, medical doctors, didn't like it because it was claiming to be a science,
Right.
and they were not comfortable at all because it was dealing in subject areas which weren't quite repeatable and what have you, and testable in and of themselves. And so I think a lot of scientists don't want to share, right?
Sure.
They like to hold on to that name, like we're the only true scientist, right? We
Yeah.
get that on the Big Bang Theory with Sheldon always
Right.
making fun of engineers, right? So,
Right.
well, let's jump to something else. Would you consider the quote unquote alien a liminal figure that we create in order to get our minds around the fact that a phenomenon exists for which there is no other rational explanation?
Okay.
Have we anthropomorphized, yeah, excuse me, the phenomenon this way, superimposing a quasi-human face on the mysterious, the quote unquote secret machine? I'm sorry, but I was quoting you there, and we just talked about that a little bit. But
Mhm.
can you when you say a liminal figure,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, liminal figure, of course, comes from anthropology and from,
right,
again, from religious studies. The idea that there is a space between this world and the next, or between this culture and another culture, and in that borderline, that liminus, that 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 gate between the two worlds, you have figures that go in and out, who have experiences, and they bring these experiences back to the rest of us. The alien may be a stand-in for that figure, someone who stands between this world and the next. And we do anthropomorphize it to a certain extent. I think again, we go back to the idea of the UFO itself. This is why the machine and the alien is kind of inextricable here. We can't really separate them as neatly as we would like. And I think the reason is when we see a machine flying through the air or seeming to fly through the air, we make a lot of assumptions immediately because we've made machines that fly through the air. And in those machines, there are pilots or there are passengers or they are piloted by something like a drone, for instance, a drone operator. There's always a human figure behind it. So with that in our mind, we look at a UFO and we think there must be a figure behind it. We anthropomorphize the alien as if it's a being at the controls flying a machine. This could be absolutely true, but in some cases, maybe not. Maybe some of the things that we see are not being flown by anyone, So we're making assumptions, and these assumptions are being made based on our own personal experience of science. 100 years ago, 150 years ago, with the great airship thing, we anthropomorphized that thing to death, right?
Right.
These were ships with sails, for crying out loud, and they had
Yeah.
anchors, right? But there was one telltale fact, one detail that was there, that is still there, and that is the searchlight. For some reason, these people in the 1890s saw these ships with a massive searchlight underneath it, scouring the earth that would go on and off the searchlight, which is the same as what we're seeing today with people who've had these contacts. They see the ship come by with lights underneath it. There are searchlights. In some cases, very bright lights, and they turn on and they turn off. We've seen this trope in science fiction movies even. So we know this is something that we had experienced. People saw ships because that's all they understood. They didn't see an airplane because they've never seen an airplane. We didn't have them yet until the Wright brothers after the great airship experiences. We saw balloons, right? But these ships were not balloons. Oddly enough, they were not like the Montgolfier balloons.
That's right. Yeah.
We didn't see balloons. We saw ships. We saw piloted craft, and that's the important thing. What we did is we changed it. We changed these images, or we didn't. They did, or some communication, some combination of what they were transmitting and what we received resulted in this image of a flying ship with a searchlight.
Yeah.
So yeah, we do anthropomorphize a lot. I think the alien is somewhat anthropomorphized. It may be that they don't have a head, two arms, and two legs. But then the problem is, how come we don't go all the way and anthropomorphize it? How come these beings don't have hair? How come they don't have genitals, to be quite frank?
Mhm.
Sorry, children. How come they don't have, other orifices? They don't eat, they don't drink, they don't sleep. We don't anthropomorphize them 100%. We're meeting them halfway. So there's a machine-like aspect to these things, and we're trying to fit this into some kind of a medium we can feel comfortable with, an object that we can understand, two arms, two legs, a head, large eyes, all the rest of it. And yet we don't go 100%. They don't talk to us. They communicate mentally to us. They put images in our brain. And that putting images in our brain should be the clue
Yeah.
that what we're seeing is an image created by someone or something else. The airships, possibly the UFOs, the Tic Tacs. Well, Tic Tacs are on video. But are they? You know what I mean? Is there a way of putting an image onto our videos that we don't understand yet when something is not there? These are all questions we have to ask. We don't have to answer them right away, but we do have to ask them, or else we're just whistling in the dark.
Yeah. Well, interesting too about the 1897 airship mystery. I remember reading. I mean, the when they did come down off the ship and they would ask for water,
Right.
you kind of use your well, but they were all pretty much humans. They sometimes are dressed in like little outfits and uniforms that looked like much like the uniforms of the day. A lot of them had beards.
Yeah.
And they would climb up a rope, sometimes 100, 200 feet up. I don't know how many people can do that. But it was fascinating how that works. I was rereading uh, John Keel every few years. I like to go through him because I find him absolutely fascinating.
Absolutely. Yes.
And yeah, and I know you and Keel share a lot about this phenomenon. But he talked about the reflective nature of the phenomenon. And in chapter 3 of Man, you stated that it's possible that we have been projecting our own image onto the phenomenon since time immemorial. That may be the key to understanding it. What do you mean by projecting our own image? And is that a Jungian interpretation of the phenomenon?
Hmm. Well, Jung, of course, just said, the flying saucer represented a mandala, right? This
Yeah.
was an attempt by society to integrate themselves, to become self-individuated, et cetera. So he went all out on that one. Um, I like another term that he
Okay.
created, which has obsessed me for a long time. He referred to the UFO, or the UFOs in general, as technological angels. And that term resonated with me because it combines two completely, what we would consider completely opposite ideas, right? Technology and angels. And these are technological angels. They're coming from the sky. They may be benevolent, we don't know, but they're also technology. They're machines. They're machines and they're angels, and the critique of angels against technology and technology against angels is what I think is really interesting. So um, if we're projecting our image onto the idea of the angel, which is entirely possible, given human history and the ways we've depicted angels as human beings with wings, right? Human beings that fly, or angels that are simply messengers that just show up and do something to us and then disappear again. We may have been projecting our image onto these beings since time immemorial. If we talk about, I study ancient Jewish mysticism a lot, Merkava mysticism, Hechalot, and all kinds of other variations of that. And the idea that there are angelic beings that just simply show up, and they may have names, we call them by a certain way, and there's technologies for talking to them or reaching them, but they show up and they disappear. They show up through the Bible, they show up through various other works, and they share so much in common with what we think of as the alien that it's not funny, right? Even to the point, and I don't want to be blasphemous here. Well, I do kind of. No, I
Go
don't.
right ahead.
I don't
Right.
want to be
Yeah.
blasphemous.
All
But
right.
if we think about Christianity, we think about the origin story of Jesus. There is, Mary who's pregnant by some unknown force, right? And she gives birth to a baby who becomes Jesus. Um, there's elements of the alien abduction myth right in there. And then
Yeah.
there's Elizabeth who gets pregnant, and she's very old, and she gets pregnant miraculously. And we talk about these things as miracles. We're at the point now where science can duplicate a lot of this, we know. But were these all, were these ways of dealing with an idea that was anthropomorphizing our relationship to the alien being a kind of human, as it says, the sons of God and the daughters of men? How was that possible in Genesis that an alien being could cohabit with human women and give birth to the race of the Nephilim, to the race of the giants, right? Genetically speaking, that should not be possible, right? It's two different species, but maybe then, according to Genesis, they're not two different species. They're just different, slightly different, but they still share the same kind of DNA. They're
Right.
still capable of producing offspring. And there was this unconscious idea in Genesis that this happened. And when it happened, Noah got, everybody freaked out and there was the flood, right? And then God tried to destroy the world. Oh, no, you can't have that, right? So there's this idea that there are beings from space who come down and cohabit with human people, humans. So we pull that thread a little bit. And what does that mean? Is the alien human? Does the alien have enough human characteristics that this kind of relationship is possible? Or are we just making this up? And
Yeah.
that's where we
That's where we are, I
that's
think.
where
Right.
we are. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Someday we ought to get into a conversation about the whole idea of the virgin birth and how far back it goes, and
Oh yeah. Oh, that's
the magi is maybe being the men in black showing up, and you know
well, that's good. That's
uh,
good for an hour right there.
I would say so.
Yeah.
Now, well, sticking with biblical things a little bit, you stated that the warnings of global catastrophes have been a staple of divine prophecy since the earliest biblical writings in the West and have percolated into the popular culture. Why do the aliens always warn of environmental catastrophes? I mean, really,
Because they live
it's got
here.
to be. I mean, wouldn't you think that they would be saying something instead like, hey, this is who we are, and this is where we come from, and this is what reality is all like, and, sort of set the stage a little bit and then say, and now you have that basic picture. Let me tell you what you're doing wrong. And,
Mhm.
but they just seem to jump right in.
Yeah.
It's like they're living here with us, right next to us, and we're screwing something up for them, and they don't like it.
Right.
But they don't want to tell us anything else.
Well, you pretty much answered the question. Uh,
Oh, okay.
yeah. I mean, my reaction is because they live here. Maybe that's why. But it's not only that though. You go back to the Bible, to the earliest prophecies. They're all about doom and destruction. There was never a prophet who showed up and said, "Hey guys, you're doing great.
Right.
Keep it up."
Right.
We
Right.
never had that. Or a prophet who comes by and says, well, you're screwing up here and here, but if you do this, everything will be fine. Never happens this way. They just show up and say, you're all going to die. That's it. You screwed up. You're evil. You can't save anything. Sodom, Gomorrah, goodbye. Nuclear blast, Holocaust, it's over. So we never get somebody coming up and saying, you're doing a good job. And the aliens are no different. And that's what bothers me about this, right? The aliens are fulfilling that biblical prophecy meme, by showing up and saying, you're all going to die. The universe is being destroyed. It's all your fault. This may be part of our anthropomorphization process. Is that a word? Where we
Yeah.
are trying to humanize this entity by making the entity fit into this mold, of this divine judgment upon us, which is what there was a lot of talk about this, or references to this even at DoD, right? I
Right.
mean, we're dealing with demons and angels, and we don't know. This is unchristian. We can't deal with UFOs because this is God doesn't want us to.
Yeah, Collins elite. Yes.
The Collins elite. So we're back into that mode. We have to extricate this stuff from each other, because we're not learning anything this way. We're just promoting and anthropomorphizing and projecting our fears and our insecurities onto this experience. And it's a mirror, and we're looking into it, and it's not a good look. We
Yeah.
have to do something about that. And I think that we're getting this. Maybe it's not a prediction of actual catastrophe, although climate change looks like it's heading that way. But it's not necessarily a prediction of an actual catastrophe, but it's picking up our own anxieties about what we're doing and reflecting it back to us, as if to say to us, well, then do something about it. If you're that worried about X, Y, or Z, fix it, right? But
Well,
without
that sounds
telling,
Jungian. Yeah.
well, yeah, that sounds
Yeah.
Jungian, or it
Yeah.
sounds kind of Star Trek also, right?
Yeah.
If
Right.
we can't get involved in the other planet, we cannot unfairly
Right.
move or do anything, manipulate the situation. All we can do is watch and move on. So maybe that's happening. I mean, I don't know, but this thing does bother me. The idea that they just show up to bitch at us and then leave.
Yeah. Yeah. Never anything nice.
No.
You stated that we observe phenomena that have no scientific explanation and then discard the observations because they don't fit the theory, rather than retooling the theory to fit the observations. Does science need to expand its boundaries to accept the phenomenon? Do we need what William James called a radical empiricism?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's starting to happen. We have some scientists who have now opened up about this. They're willing to
Yeah.
accept it. We have Avi Loeb as a famous example, but we have others, and they are extending, they're expanding their boundaries to do this. I think it's really necessary because, as we said before, reality, what a concept, right?
Yeah.
Reality is something that's a social construct right now. We kind of understand it's a social construct, it's a genetic construct in a sense. I mean, it's a survival mechanism. We know we experience only what we need to survive. But at this point, our survival odds are getting narrower and narrower. I know I don't want to sound like an alien making predictions, but just on the basis of population and pollution and all the rest of it, wars with nuclear weapons and all of this. So we have to come to a different understanding, a different interpretation of what reality is. And in order to do that, we have to expand our horizons on that. And, oddly enough, I think expanding our horizons on reality is not only going to include other paradigms, other ways of looking at reality, it's going to include other people's experience of reality. And I think that's also very important. Science needs to appreciate that as well. They need to expand the barriers a little bit, where we incorporate what other people have said or thought about reality, other cultures, because the West right now has this seeming stranglehold on it, and we may be a little suicidal that way because we're not incorporating other visions of reality. We're not incorporating other ideas, other possibilities, other potential, because we're so blinded by our own technological advances. We're going down, one particular dark alley, and we're not really realizing there's other streets running parallel and perpendicular that we could be walking on that could
Yeah.
give us a greater sense of where we really are and how to solve some of these problems.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I know, Tom Bullard
Mm.
mentions, and Jacques Vallée bring this up too. This whole idea of taking the science to the phenomenon where you do a field centric study, much like
Yeah.
anthropologists will do, and people in the field. If you want to study something, you go to the field and you study it, and you write the science based on what you see and what was the observable evidence, and perhaps that might be the way to sort of push this phenomena research into the phenomena into the scientific realm. But we'll see. Earlier on in the conversation, we talked about consciousness, and I really want to get into that right now. And let me ask you the big question up front. Do you think we will ever get to the bottom of the what is consciousness problem, and why it is important that we actually do that?
Maybe the question should be phrased differently. Maybe it's not a question of what is consciousness, as if consciousness is a solid, measurable thing, right? Maybe we need to explore different modalities of consciousness, different consciousness types, in order to get a better understanding of what this consciousness thing is.
Right.
We may be looking at it again from a scientific point of view. We're trying to nail it down, right? And
Right.
it's notoriously tricky to do that. So you have some physicists saying that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain. That's the famous quotation, right? That consciousness comes out of the brain. My personal approach to it, and of course I'm not a scientist, so who cares? But my approach to it is that the brain is an emergent property of consciousness. It's the reverse. Consciousness pre-existed everything. Consciousness was there in some form as information, perhaps. And consciousness is organizing matter around itself. And we're still in that process of being organized since the Big Bang, or whenever it was that started this whole thing. So I think that consciousness has always been there. Our consciousness seems very limited because of a number of factors we talked about. Our perception of reality is limited compared to what's actually out there. But it's also, how shall I put it? It's we don't think the way scientists solve equations.
Right.
The way we think in the world, the way we relate to reality, is really more quantum mechanical than it is Newtonian, right? It's a possible way of looking at it. We kind of instinctively understand ideas like entanglement, for instance, right? It's a beautiful thing that two quantum particles, once they meet, are forever in contact on opposite sides of the universe. If you change the spin on one, the other one automatically changes. That's really anthropomorphizing a scientific principle, and scientists will scream that I'm doing that. But there's the kind of a way that we operate in the world that's kind of like that. We accept synchronicity as part of life. We accept dreams influencing our behavior and our actions. We accept some really crazy stuff out there. There's a lot of crazy things going on politically and everything else, where people are just making stuff up and believing in it. And this is happening because we haven't gotten a handle on consciousness. We haven't gotten a handle on reality. We think that reality and information is the same thing, and therefore any information is good information.
Mm-hmm.
So that whatever we think is true. And that's taking this way into another direction where it's not going to be very fruitful, because science has to correct back and say, yes, what you think is possible, but then you have to actually do it. You've got to have the tools to do it and make it happen. And there's much more that's possible than we're aware of at any given point in time. But I think that ideas of consciousness as something that is developing within the brain is probably, in my way of thinking, a mistake, because that's like saying, you have a radio, and the radio is picking up different stations. But if your radio is broken, the stations have stopped broadcasting, right? I think the brain is like a radio, and we are tuned to different frequencies, and we are picking up consciousness of different types of different kinds. If we die and the brain stops functioning, does that mean that consciousness has disappeared? That's the ultimate question, right? That's the
Right.
$64,000 question. Do we survive in some way? And why is this question relative to the discussion of UFOs? And that's because the UFO researchers now are starting to focus on near-death experiences and life after death and all of that as being part of this entire experience of the phenomenon. There is some connection to all of this. If consciousness survives the destruction of the radio, the transistor radio, I'm dating myself, and and it's still broadcasting out there, then consciousness still exists. Our individual station tuning maybe is not there, but it could be duplicated again, right? You build
Sure.
another radio and you tune back into consciousness again. So I think consciousness is broadcasting and we're just the receivers. And sometimes we're the transceivers, we're the transmitters as well, right?
Yeah.
We start to study the spiritual disciplines that people talk about, and we start to develop the ability to transmit as well as to receive better. And then, the Dalai Lama right now, for instance, is practicing a type of yoga that prepares him for death so that his consciousness will remain basically intact and then become reincarnated in someone else. That's the belief, right? So there's like a specific process for doing that in Tibetan religion. So if all of that is possible, we're looking at the aliens who've been here for thousands and thousands of years. We've experienced them for thousands and thousands of years. The question is, are these the same aliens, right? They just have never died. Maybe because they're machines, or maybe because they have an alternate way of handling this consciousness problem than we do. And again, we're back to consciousness and we're back to trying to understand it and using a multidisciplinary approach and all those things we've been talking about.
Yeah.
God, I'm garrulous.
No, no, no. I actually love it. We could probably spend the whole, a whole show just on this. But you'd spend a lot of time in man discussing consciousness and DNA consciousness and DNA in particular, and you delve into the work of Crick, and the beginnings of DNA and the discovery of the chromosomes and things along those lines, um, and the human genetic code. And you also mentioned the concept of something called directed panspermia. Can you explain what you mean by that, or what Crick might have meant by that?
Yeah, it was Crick that came up. I mean, he didn't necessarily come up with it, but he wrote a paper on it. He
Hmm.
defended this idea. Crick, of course, was one of the three, discoverers of the double helix, the structure of the DNA code, as we know. But that was like in 1960, right? So
Right.
that wasn't that long ago. And the reason that I'm fascinated by DNA, Crick's discovery in particular, but also all this research that's been done since then on DNA, is that it's astonishing. It doesn't make sense really, in a way. Four chemicals, four letters of the alphabet create everything that lives on this planet. Every living thing is composed of DNA, and the DNA only has four freaking letters in that particular. So the dictionary, the encyclopedia is vast with only four letters. I use 26 letters when I write my overly long books, and I can't imagine, doing it with only four letters, which
Yeah.
probably my readers would appreciate if I tried. But you have four letters, and the combinations of them, the mathematical combinations of them, create everything that exists. And yet, even with those four letters, there are only 64 possible combinations of those four letters in groups of three. Now, you have to read the book to understand this and look at the charts and stuff. But there's only 64 possible nucleotides. So you have, a G and a T together, for instance, and then there's a sugar and a phosphate, and that's a nucleotide. And then you put three of them together, and that forms one of the codons of the genetic code. There are 64 possible combinations, 64 codons. 64 seemed like a weird number, right? We're all
Yeah.
sort of base 10, because we have 10 fingers and 10 toes, and we think in terms of 10. But not every culture did. Not every culture does. And 64 seemed like an odd number to be the basis of all existence, living existence, organic life. And then I realized, of course, that the I Ching, the famous Chinese book of changes, is created and developed exactly the same way. There are 64 possible combinations of solid and broken lines in groups of three. So you have 64 hexagrams. So, and that series of 64 hexagrams basically discusses all the process that exists in the universe, right? According to the Chinese philosophy, whatever exists can be found on this chart. It's the process of changing from one state to another, which is a very important concept. And Leibniz, the famous mathematician of a couple of hundred years ago, then he devoted a lot of study to the I Ching, to those 64 hexagrams, because he felt this was the beginning of the binary code, right, that we use today in computers. But it goes back further than that. I write about it in more depth in Sekret Machines, because it's not only the 64 that fascinates me, but it's the double helix of the DNA. Helices exist in nature, right? We find them in a lot of different places. We'd never find a double helix, one helix wrapped around another,
Right.
that famous symbol. That does not exist in nature except in the DNA molecule. And yet, in esoteric traditions, again, starting in China, hundreds of years ago, they depict the father and the mother of creation as two beings with tails that wrap around each other in a double helix. And since we didn't know about that until 1960, these people writing hundreds of years ago sort of identified that. And they were also the people who talked about 64 hexagrams. So you have the combination of the 64 hexagrams, the double helix creation, and the process of creation in a nice, neat package in China hundreds and hundreds of years ago. I mean, the I Ching goes back more than 1,000 years. So we're talking about a kind of unconscious realization. I mean, if we have the genetic code in every cell of our body, it kind of would stand to reason that we kind of unconsciously think in those terms, that we have that image is there somewhere, right? Possibly. Of course, I'm being very speculative and very fanciful on this, but if every cell in our body has a double helix in it, and it's a manifestation of those 64 possible combinations, I mean, that's who we are. And the Chinese understood it somehow, and in other cultures in Africa, they understood it. They developed similar ideas, similar pictures, serpents and the hexagrams and the whole thing. The idea of changes through a binary code system of process. All of this is everywhere in the world. We've ignored it because it was superstition. It was divination. It was to tell the future. It was stuff that is not scientific. And then we go
Well,
one step further. One more thing is these two
sure.
mathematicians in Kazakhstan freaked me out when they published a paper a couple of years ago. And they said that there's something really weird about how the chromosomes are arranged, because there are stop codes and start codes separating one group from another. If they didn't, we'd be horribly misshapen, right? We wouldn't be the way we are. We wouldn't have separate things for arms, legs, eyes, and all the rest of it. So they asked the question, how does it happen that between one code and another code, there's a specific code that says stop, now start again, like a period at the end of a sentence? So in genetics, there is no run-on sentence. There are periods that break up these sequences. And they said, mathematically, that shouldn't be possible. I mean, zero was not even discovered until a few hundred years ago. The
Right.
Roman numerals didn't have zero. They used all the L's and M's and X's and I's. There was no way to compute using zero. The Aztecs had zero, and in ancient India, they had zero. Eventually, they brought that to the West, and that became part of math. But there's no zero in nature, like there's no double helix in nature. To the two scientists, something had to have invented or programmed the genetic code to start and stop appropriately. They looked at it and they said, this is math. This is not, this is not biology. This is not some normal process. What normal process has a zero built in, or a period? So take all of that, right? And Crick came up with this idea of directed panspermia. First, panspermia itself, as the name implies, means that somehow the DNA code was seeded all over the universe and only took in certain places. Directed panspermia, which is what Crick wrote about, says that someone or something deliberately seeded the planet with the genetic code, with RNA possibly before DNA, but deliberately did the seeding. It was directed, it was intentional, because there are certain chemicals that you need to create DNA for it to flourish, and they're in very short supply in the universe. They only exist in certain places. And in order for the DNA to flourish, They had to pick a planet where there was some of that chemical present, or else the whole thing would have fallen flat on its face. And that was Francis Crick's idea of directed panspermia. To answer your question after like an hour, but yeah.
No, that's well. Wait to hear the next one, because I think you drifted a little bit into one of my favorite topics that you bring up in man, the idea of DNA consciousness. And first of all, I mean, it's just a few questions here. First of all, what do you mean by that? And then, can you also discuss consciousness and its possible relationship to the abduction phenomenon? And while you're at it, can you mention the possible relationship between consciousness and quantum mechanics? And I'll give you 3 hours or
Uh,
3 days. Yes.
yeah, 3 days might be more like it. DNA consciousness. Well, yeah, here we go back to the idea of emergent property of the brain. What is consciousness? Does it emerge from the brain, or does the brain, is it a function of consciousness? This goes back to something that I found fascinating. I wrote about this in Sinister Forces at some length, and no one understood what the devil I was talking about, and I think they probably still don't. But there's two eminent scientists, Sir Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. Penrose is a world-famous mathematician and scientist. Stuart Hameroff is an anesthesiologist, but he's more than that. He's a professor of anesthesiology, but basically he's an anesthesiologist. And these two guys got together because they were looking at each other's work, and they thought that maybe there was a crossover possibility there to come up with a new definition, a new explanation for the mechanics of consciousness. And it's really complicated. Okay, it's really complex. We won't go into all of it at the point now, but it does involve something called microtubules in the brain. These are very tiny, tiny, tiny structures in the brain. They're like 25, I think, nanometers. So that's really embarrassingly small. But it was the smallness of them and the fact that they seem to be transmitting information across synapses or across spaces in between them that gave rise to Hameroff and Penrose thinking, where does this stuff go and where's it coming from? Is there a quantum effect taking place in the human brain? Is that possible? Is the brain a kind of quantum computer? And of course, that was dismissed almost immediately by scientists. They say, okay, you're talking about reactions at the Planck scale, right? We're talking about extremely tiny place. These kinds of quantum reactions require these very small, not only the small space, but it requires temperatures approaching absolute zero. To get what you're trying to achieve in the human brain is not possible. It's too warm, it's too wet, it's too everything. You guys are dreaming, forget about it. They insisted, though, that they had evidence to show that this effect was taking place, that there was a quantum computer somehow operating in the brain. And they acknowledged the fact of the temperatures, the Planck constant, all this other stuff. And a couple of years ago, just before I started working on Sekret Machines, a paper came out which kind of vindicated Penrose and Hameroff. And it said, well, wait a minute, photosynthesis occurs at the quantum level. They're taking light, plants are taking light and transmitting and transforming light into nutrients for the plants to grow. That's a quantum effect. And it's happening in ambient temperature, not in absolute zero, not at the scales you're talking about, but in ambient temperature. Light molecules, light photons are being transmitted, transubstantiated, to use a Catholic
Yeah.
expression, and they're becoming, edible light, right? So Stewart and Hameroff, suddenly they're saying, well, yeah, that's what we've been saying all along, right? These things can happen in ambient temperature. They can happen on the scales that we're talking about. And, why isn't it? Why isn't it possible? So there's a relationship then between consciousness and quantum mechanics, at least in the brain, at least according to Penrose and Hameroff. Now you're asking, why an anesthesiologist would be involved in this. Have you ever had a colonoscopy, children?
Yes. Absolutely. Every 10 years. I've got one
Every-
coming up in about 6 months. Yeah.
yeah, you have my condolences.
Thank you. Yes.
You know what happens, right? They give you a drug. Quite often it's sodium pentothal.
Mhm.
Be careful, Jim. And they give you a sodium pentothal drug, and then you're out. But you're not really out because you're obeying instructions. Turn over, roll over, do this, do that. But you have no consciousness of it. and you wake up after it with no memory of what happened, right? Hameroff saw that, millions of times, right, in hospital settings. And he's fascinated by this idea, as I am. Like, what happens to that experience? Where does it go, right? You have no conscious experience. You have no memory of it. It's there, and now it's gone. But it's got to be in there somewhere. Something happened to the brain. And so Hameroff, in his discussions with Penrose, who's like a mathematician and scientist, is saying, yeah, you got a point there. And they start working on this together to develop this idea that there's something they called orchestrated objective reduction. We won't go into it, OR, but you'll read it in the book. And they're coming up with this model for how consciousness might be related to DNA, that the DNA itself is doing this is creating consciousness in a sense, or creating the receiver for consciousness by developing the nanotubules in the brain to perform these quantum functions. Like, it's all an interrelated model. And Hameroff and Penrose, and I'm really obliterating their theory by truncating it so much. But please read the book, or read Penrose's book on the subject. Oh God, what's the name of it? Okay, you'll see it's in the book. It's cited. So Penrose writes about it, and if you've ever seen that film called "What the Bleep Do We Know," you'll have Hameroff and Penrose talking, or at least I think Hameroff anyway is talking about it in that video as well. So it's worth it just for that, if nothing else.
Yeah. My wife's doctoral advisor was in that film, Candace Pert,
Oh, okay.
who wrote The Molecules of Emotion. Yeah. Now, there was another a theory you mentioned regarding consciousness, and it's popular in some circles. It's called panpsychism, which claims that consciousness permeates the universe and that all things are conscious to some degree. First of all, can you explain panpsychism a little bit? And does that mean that a tree has consciousness, or a rock has consciousness, or is it just what we would call animate objects? I mean, if everything is made out of patterns of energy, I guess everything in the universe should be, right, have a consciousness to it.
Right. This is, again, we're jumping the gun because we don't know what consciousness is yet. So is a rock conscious? A lot of people will say, well, no, it obviously isn't conscious. Well, how do you know? What can you define consciousness for me? Take your time, right? So we don't know, right? We don't know what consciousness is, so we're kind of operating backwards to front here. But that's okay, because that's how we're going to have to discover this for ourselves in some way.
Right.
We got to do it somehow. Panpsychism, pan meaning everywhere or everything, and psychism meaning psyche, a spirit, a consciousness. Everything has consciousness. Yes, that's what panpsychism is. And it was kind of popular really in the 19th century, also in the 20th century for a bit. We had philosophers writing about the possibility of panpsychism. It's come back into vogue a little bit. If you read Quanta magazine, or you read some of the articles on Medium and stuff by scientists, and or by people observing science, they're starting to talk about how this idea of panpsychism is coming back into the fore, that maybe there is a way to look at everything being conscious. We kind of know now that plants seem to have consciousness. And I don't mean in the 1960s, everything's alive, man, especially reefer. I'm talking about, real, like a tree in a forest is somehow communicating with another tree somewhere else. And they've been doing experiments to show that trees warn each other about an invasive species, or they try to protect each other from the invasive species. And there's like
Yeah.
this weird relationship that trees have with each other in forests, and that plants have, and this is to all those vegetarians out there, you're still eating conscious beings. Okay, just letting you
Yeah.
know. Okay. Eat rocks, because we don't know if they're conscious or not. They're the safest thing to eat right now. So, do plants scream? Are they in pain? And they've stuck what do you call them?
Polygraph.
Polygraphs, galvanic skin,
Yeah.
detectors to register emotional responses in plants. That goes back again to the 60s and 70s, but it's still a viable way of looking at things. We're talking about the possibility that everything has consciousness, and if everything does, even our silly, robotic aliens may have consciousness. They may be composed of elements that are conscious, and their consciousness may be the result of their structure, what they're made of and how they are made, how they are put together, if indeed they are machines. We're trying to create conscious machines right now. are artificial intelligence programs, which scare the hell out of me because we don't know what the hell we're doing with it, and we don't know what the implications are. All credit to Ray Kurzweil. I see you have your book on his shelf as I do on mine.
Oh, you can actually see it? Oh, okay.
Oh, I have all of those books, by the way.
You have all this? Yeah, I'm sure.
I've got them all.
Okay.
And I was surprised to see everybody that I talk to these days has Kurzweil on their shelf, that big black book,
Yeah, the
the
singularity.
singularity
Yes.
is near. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is a problem for us because we don't know how to handle it yet. We don't know what consciousness is, but we're trying to give consciousness to a machine. Good luck with that, right? We don't know what the implications are. We don't know how consciousness evolves, develops, or fine tunes itself. And then would a machine act based on its consciousness and not on commands from a human controller? All of these things we have to address some way. And we're also putting our cultural biases, we're programming them into the artificial intelligence algorithms, which is another funny thing. And it's been written about in different places. It's not broadly understood, but we're making assumptions about reality, and we're programming them into artificial intelligence machines, which could also be a big mistake. But this gets back to your question. Panpsychism says that there's consciousness in everything. I agree in a guarded sense, saying that we really don't know what consciousness is yet. But theoretically, why wouldn't a rock be consciousness? Tell me what the theory is. Is it because there's no DNA in the rock? Okay, now we're talking about DNA consciousness. Plants would have consciousness, they have DNA. Birds, animals, everything has consciousness. It all has DNA. A rock doesn't have DNA. So, okay, it doesn't have consciousness. If that's the rule we're making, then I will agree with you, the rock has no consciousness. But we have to prove that. We have to prove that
Right.
DNA is the arbiter of what is or is not conscious. And that's where we're at right now.
Okay. Now, we're running out of time a little bit, and I have about 4 or 5 more questions. But let me just sort of ask you a final question here, and then we'll wrap this one up, and then we'll talk to AC and Tom and figure out if we can do. I know we're going to be doing a third one, but we might want to do even 3.5 or 4 down the road. But towards the end of the book, you I'm going to read a quote. You're quoting you here, which I found fascinating, and I just wanted you to comment on this. You said, for the most part, the phenomenon is a random series of appearances, visitations, even abductions. It happens to us. We don't happen to it. There is probably no other human experience that comes close to making us such passive observers slash victims, except for some natural disasters. One thinks of an earthquake, or a volcanic eruption, or a tornado, or rape. You want to sort of comment on that a little bit? That's pretty provocative, and I think it's sort of profound, and at the same time.
In your presentation, especially, I was getting a little nervous.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I mean,
Delivery, all
it's what
delivery.
it does. Yeah, what it does is it does make us into victims. Regarding my own experiences, and what you mentioned Whitley earlier too. I mean, things happened, to people. Things happen to people all the time. People aren't necessarily going. I mean, the mystics will go out searching for this sometimes, and remote viewers and what have you. But for the most part, most people aren't. Then all of a sudden, out of a clear blue sky, boom, and I don't know where to place all. I don't know how to fit that in.
Well, this kind of goes back to everything we've discussed so far, but it also prefigures our next discussion on Secret Machines War. Um, it happens to us is true. The UFO experience, it happens to us. It's not something that we control. No government on Earth can command the UFO phenomenon to behave, to do something, to show up here, go there, do this or do that. They can try to communicate with it. I believe the Soviets, in the days of the old Soviet Union, there was a special case out there at a nuclear missile silo where they claimed that they could kind of communicate to the UFO in a way using hand gestures, and it would do things like in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, right? All of that stuff, right? The 5 tones, the dee 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 dee. So
Oh yeah,
you would use gestures, and they would repeat the gestures and that kind of thing. But for the most part, um, I think that it happens to us. We are in the position of being victims, basically. If you want to look at it in a negative way, we're victimized by the phenomenon. Why is that? We're happy with consensus reality. We're happy with the way we think reality is. We don't want to rock the boat. We can fantasize about things, we can dream, we can pray to deities, but it's all within a social context and it's all within a cultural context that's under our control. But what's the UFO does is it shows up. It just shows up and it threatens that consensus reality. So we're kind of in the position of a victim anyway, no matter how we look at it, because we can't control this thing. We have to learn to live with it. Smile and try to endure what's being done to you, by this outside force, because you have no other way to defend yourself, or no way that we know of. So yeah, all of these things that happen, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, specifically rape, because a lot of alien abductees report that that's happening, report that that's, it's a physical violation, whether or not it's rape or not, but it's still a physical violation. And it's a physical violation of men, of women. It doesn't matter. It's a violation. And let's not even get started on animal mutilations, right? If they're involved in what that
Right.
possibility might be. So we are in the position of being victims of this in our way of thinking. Maybe in its way of thinking, we're not. Maybe they're being helpful. Maybe they think they're being helpful, or they think they're being generous in some way. I don't know. But I think that we are in that position of being the recipients and the we're not actors in this. We are being acted upon. And that's what bothers all of us, I think, who study this phenomenon. And John Keel has talked about it, and Jacques Vallée has talked about it. Is it a control mechanism? Are we being controlled by this thing? Are these little moments of control? And are these only the moments that we remember of that control?
Right. Excellent answer. Thank you so much. Well, we're going to have to wrap this up, this session of TTS Talks. We'll be back with episode 11 of TTS Talks with Peter Levenda very soon. Peter, once again, thanks for spending time with us today, and we'll be chatting with you again soon. As a reminder, all of the Sekret Machines books are available at tothestars.media. You can stay up to date with TTS by finding us on social media, Instagram at tothestars.media, Twitter at tothestarsmedia.and, and no, just To The Stars Media, and Facebook at To The Stars Inc. Peter, where can listeners find you once again?
I'm on social media for my sins, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can probably find me there. I'll have my own website up and running one of these days. And of course, the books are available wherever you buy books.
And thanks again for tuning into TTS Talks, everybody. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast, rate and review us over Apple Podcasts, and we will catch you next time for part 3 of this 3-part series discussing Sekret Machines, Gods, Man, and War. And maybe, and AC, maybe AC sort of the general factotum here. She runs everything. Maybe we can get even Tom on a separate TTS podcast with Peter and myself, and chatting about this and about all the trilogy in general, some of the projects we have and we're working on currently. Peter, once again, thank you. You're just absolutely amazing, man.
My
And
pleasure.
oh yeah, and we'll look forward to talking to you again very, very soon.